Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into what is, I think you'd agree, arguably the most frustrating and foundational question in all of philosophy, the nature of identity. And we're not talking about, your career or your social identity. We are talking about the metaphysical bedrock of sameness. How can anything truly remain itself when everything we observe is in this state of continuous, relentless flux?
Everything, from the atoms in our bodies to the light from distant stars.
Exactly. So our source material for this deep dive, it's drawn from a pre-specialized domain called ontological mathematics. And this framework offers, well, it's not just an answer. The claim is that it's a truly radical resolution to the identity paradox.
A resolution that says the problem was never really a problem with reality.
Right. It was an error in categorization, a mistake made centuries ago in classical metaphysics. So our mission today is to follow these sources as they pull the concept of identity out of those lower derived layers of reality, where philosophers usually debate the ship of Theseus or personal continuity.
Right, the usual thought experiments.
And they place it squarely into the fundamental omnilectic and hololectic layers, the mathematical substrate of the universe. They root identity in something called hypergravity identity, which is defined as the ultimate mathematical invariant, the central fixed point of all existence. So get ready to understand you in terms of things like coherence, tensors, and mathematical unity.
What's fascinating here is the sources argue that the classical philosophical challenge is just fundamentally ill-posed. The paradox is so brutal because it basically states if identity is absolute, some fixed substantive essence, then change is impossible. Reality has to be static.
The frozen universe.
Exactly. But if identity is relative or dynamic, then it ceases to be identity. The term loses all meaning. It's a true philosophical catch-22, and it's held metaphysics hostage for millennia.
But the material we're looking at says this tension, this paradox, it only exists because of what they call mislayering.
Mislayering, I love that term.
Me too. It's this idea that classical thinkers confuse a high-level semantic observation, like the name we give a ship, with a low-level mathematical invariant. They took the effect for the cause.
So we're moving beyond this classical view of identity as a property that things have.
Right, like a label that's stuck on.
And instead, we're looking at it as a coherence invariant of the entire underlying reality. Identity becomes really the mathematics of persistence.
Okay, so before we introduce this radical solution, let's really nail down the problem precisely. We need to detail why the classical framework fails so spectacularly when it's confronted with the identity paradox.
According to these sources, yeah.
It all comes down to three implicit foundational assumptions that are just baked into classical thinking. And they're essentially roadblocks. Let's start with assumption number one. Classical identity is substance. It's oncontic. So if you go back to Aristotle or Plato, identity is treated as this fundamental thingness, an inherent material stuff or an essence that has to persist totally unchanged for the object to remain itself.
And you can immediately see the problem there. If your identity is tied to the stuff,
and the stuff is always changing,
then your identity is always under threat. It's constantly dissolving. The sources argue that this makes the object fundamentally unstable because its identity is tied to its changing content.
It makes the paradox completely insoluble, right? Because change is the one constant of our observed reality.
Exactly. If the identity is the substance, and the substance is in flux, the identity has to fail. It's a dead end from the start.
Which brings us directly to assumption number two. Identity is static.
Right. Unchanging. Absolute.
The classical framework demands it. It requires identity to be this absolute frozen thing. So if the definition of a self or an object requires total stasis, then every single observable dynamic process in the universe,
wave oscillation, cognitive growth, a star burning,
all of it becomes a metaphysical contradiction. How can I possibly be me if I'm fundamentally different physically and psychologically than I was 10 years ago? That classical model just can't answer that satisfactorily. It offers these fragmented, unconvincing explanations.
And that leads to the third one, which sort of ties it all together. Assumption 3, identity is intrinsic.
Ah, yes.
Classical thought assumes identity must be this singular property that belongs only to the object itself. It's independent of the environment, independent of the fundamental field of reality.
It has to carry its own unchanging internal ID tag.
That's a great way to put it. An internal static essence. This is really the search for the soul, or the atomic ID tag that never, ever wavers.
So you've got this combination, It has to be substance, it has to be static, and it has to be intrinsic. And like you said, that entire framework is just perpetually doomed. It's trying to locate the invariant inside the variable.
Which is impossible.
And it leads right to that core conundrum. How can something remain the same while changing?
Okay, so this is where the breakthrough comes in. The sources introduce hypergravity identity, or HI. And this concept, it doesn't just tweak the classical model. It systematically removes and replaces all three of those doomed assumptions.
It's a full replacement of the foundation itself.
Absolutely. So first, hypergravity identity is explicitly not substance. It is defined as invariance.
Invariance, a mathematical concept.
Precisely. It's about the pattern, the continuity of the logic, the structure. It has nothing to do with the content of the material.
Okay, so that takes care of assumption one. What about the static problem?
Well, second, HI is not static. If it were, it couldn't account for the dynamic reality we see. Instead, it's defined as coherence equilibrium.
Coherence equilibrium. Can you unpack that a bit?
Think of it not as a frozen state, but as a statal fixed point that is actively maintained within a massive, constantly shifting dynamic system. It's like a gyroscope. It's stable because it's spinning, because it's dynamic.
That's a crucial distinction. It's stable because it's dynamic, not despite it. A complete inversion of the classical view.
Exactly. And third, and this is probably the biggest conceptual leap for most people, hypergravity identity is not intrinsic to the object.
It's not the internal ID tag.
No. It is emergent through reduction. Identity, the sources argue, is a feature of the background hypergravity coherence field, the foundational mathematical reality. Objects, particles, you, me, we merely express or reduce that identity unto ourselves.
So the field provides the identity. The object doesn't invent it.
That's it. The object is a local expression of a universal invariant.
Wow. The shift it's seismic. We're moving identity from being on a thing you possess to being dynamic, a coherent signature you maintain. Identity stops being the property of an object and becomes the stable attractor for the object within this universal hypergravity field.
And so the question changes. It's no longer what is the unchangeable stuff.
The question becomes, what is the persistent mathematical structure that organizes all this flux?
And that is a question we can actually answer. We're no longer searching for a soul or an essence in a ghost machine. We are analyzing the fixed point mathematics that allows a pattern, whether that pattern is a particle, a wave, or a consciousness, to be perfectly persistent within universal dynamism.
Okay, let's get absolutely precise then. This is where the sources get very specific and, frankly, very elegant. We need the formal definition of the solution. Our sources define hypergravity identity, or HI, as the invariant coherence fixed point.
The invariant coherence fixed point.
And they place this invariant at the most fundamental level of reality, the omnilectic layer. This is primordial identity.
The ground floor of existence.
Exactly. And the ontological statement that underpins all of this is mathematically simple but metaphysically massive. 0 factorial equals 1.
$0.
The sources interpret this as the fundamental act of mathematical self-identification. The hypergravity invariant identity from nothing, coherence self-identifies as unity. That statement, they claim, is the beginning of all structure.
And that equation, $0, it's not just some mathematical curiosity. In this framework, it's the genesis moment of identity itself, happening within the analytic substrate. And because this identity exists at the absolute baseline, before any complexity or reduction, the sources assign it 4 very specific, non-negotiable attributes. And understanding these is the key to dissolving the paradox.
Okay, let's go through them.
First, it is identity without essence.
Without essence.
Right. Since it precedes all specific content, all properties, all stuff, it's pure self-referential logic. It's the universe's I am that I am statement, but it's devoid of any descriptive characteristics like color or shape or charge.
So it completely sidesteps that whole essentialism debate that crippled classical philosophy. It's not the identity of something, it's the identity of being itself.
You've got it. That's the first attribute. Second, it is unity without parts.
A singularity.
In a sense. It's this singular, undivided foundation. You can't break it down or analyze it into smaller components because it is the baseline unity. This resolves all the problems of fragmentation and composition, like the ship of Theseus.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the third one?
Third, and this gets a bit technical, it is coherence without reduction.
Coherence without reduction.
Yeah, most of the coherence we see in the physical world, a laser beam, a living cell, it's the result of parts successfully interacting. It's a derived coherence.
It's an achievement of organization.
Exactly. But this primordial coherence, is the original uncaused act of selecting itself. It's the first perfectly stable mathematical statement. It doesn't result from successful organization. It is the principle of organization itself.
Wait, I need to push on that a little. If it's coherence without reduction, doesn't that make it a totally abstract concept, completely divorced from the observable world we live in?
Yeah.
How do you bridge that gap from pure, unreduced mathematical coherence to the messy observable universe?
That is the central challenge, isn't it? And the sources bridge it by stating that this unreduced coherence is effectively the source code for everything that follows. It's the absolute fixed point, which leads directly to the fourth attribute. It is invariant under all transformations.
The ultimate constant.
The ultimate constant. Since it's the mathematical base layer, anything that happens in the subsequent layers of reality, all the flux, all the change, all the physics and biology, none of it can alter this foundational fixed point. It is the only truly stable fixed point of what they call the coherence vacuum.
So this redefines everything. Identity, $0, $1, isn't something you game or lose. It's the inescapable mathematical structure provided by this hypergravity background field. And everything we recognize as identity in our world is just an expression of that fundamental structure.
A projection of it, yes.
And this leads directly into the concept of the seed tower. Because $0 doesn't exist in a vacuum. It establishes the entire coherence baseline for reality by generating other foundational seed invariants.
Right, it's the first step.
Primordial identity emerges as the very first invariant in the omnilectic substrate, and then it's joined by other necessary structures that allow reality to actually form.
And if you look at the seed tower equations in the sources, you can literally see this coherence baseline being built step by step mathematically. Beyond $0 equals 1, 1. The other invariants are crucial for setting the rules of the game.
Like what? What are the other pillars?
Well, for instance, you have $0 equals 1, 1. This gives coherence itself the ability for the system to even reference and define itself. Then there's EI pi, Euler's identity.
The most beautiful equation in mathematics.
And here it gives phase unity. This is the cyclical self-return that's necessary for wave mechanics and oscillation to happen. It ensures reality can be periodic and dynamic.
Without that, no waves, no fields, nothing.
Yeah, nothing. And finally, you have $0 and 50, which gives scale unity. This ensures that the rules of coherence hold true across all scales, from the tiniest quantum interactions to the largest cosmic structures.
So, identity, coherence, phase unity, and scale unity. These are all established as absolute primordial invariants before anything we recognize as space or time or matter even begins to reduce into form.
That's the framework. Identity is the cornerstone of this entire mathematical foundation. And so when we circle back to the classic identity paradox, the ship of Theseus, the changing self, we can finally see it for what it is.
What is it?
It's just the derived layer expression of this much deeper hypergravity identity. The paradox is what happens when classical thinkers who are stuck thinking only in layer 4 about labels and names confuse that semantic identity with the coherence identity of layer 1.
Okay, so let's move to the core mechanism of resolution. If the identity isn't in the wood of the ship or the cells of my body, where precisely is the sameness located?
That's the million-dollar question.
And the sources provide a really profound synthesis here. They say the sameness is not located in the thing that's undergoing the transformation. It resides entirely in the hypergravity field behind the thing.
Right. Identity is the invariant behind the flux, not the object within the flux.
That is the crucial redefinition. Identity isn't threatened by change because identity is the structure that persists through change.
Exactly. So what stays the same is the organizing mathematical pattern, the coherence signature, the hypergravity attractor. What changes is all the transient stuff. The substance, the content, the essence.
The sources have some great analogies to ground this. It's a very abstract concept. Let's start with the one about the standing wave in water.
That's a perfect one. So imagine a standing wave in a tank of water. The wave pattern itself looks fixed, right? It's just sitting there. But every single water molecule that makes up that wave's crests and troughs is in constant motion.
Flowing in, flowing out, being replaced instantly.
Instantly. So the identity of that standing wave is the enduring pattern, the fixed point in space. The identity is the mathematical invariant of the wave function. The water is just the content in flux.
So a classical thinker looking only at the water molecules
would conclude the wave has no identity. It's a different wave every microsecond. But the ontological view looks at the mathematical pattern that persists, the form.
And we see this exact same principle mirrored in physics with quantum numbers, right?
Absolutely. The wave function of a particle is just a riot of oscillation and probability. It's undergoing continuous transformations. But certain quantum numbers,
Yeah.
charge, spin, mass, they are conserved.
They are the fixed points.
They are the stable invariants. Even while the fundamental field is in constant dynamic motion, they are the field's expression of hypergravity identity.
So then you can apply this to consciousness, which is probably the most relatable example for everyone listening.
Yes. Your selfhood, your sense of I, it persists. It feels continuous. But your qualia, your sensory experiences, your specific thoughts, your emotional states, they are changing minute by minute, day by day.
The selfhood persists while the psychological content shifts dramatically.
The I is the standing wave. The thoughts and feelings are the water molecules flowing through it.
So hypergravity identity is the stable mathematical attractor that is expressed across all these different layers, and it gives rise to these persistent patterns in a field of constant transformation. The object changes, but the coherence pattern endures, and the identity persists as the mathematical invariance of the coherence field itself.
That's the whole model in a nutshell.
So this single primordial invariant, $0, it gets filtered or reduced across the different layers of reality. We need to look at how this one single identity shows up differently, depending on the scale and the layer of reduction.
The sources give us 4 really clear examples of this universal identity being expressed.
Yeah.
First, at the deepest physical level, particle identity in quantum field theory is totally redefined.
How so?
Particles are identical because their identity is the same hypergravity coherence invariant, just expressed as a stable field mode, a fixed gauge setting.
Okay, that's physics. What's the second example?
The continuity of consciousness. We've touched on this. The identity isn't found in a static neural network. It's found in the same qualionomic coherence. The self is the enduring, stable pattern of the consciousness field, even when the brain architecture underneath it is constantly shifting.
And third, organism identity.
Right. This is maintained as the same biofield attractor, and it persists even through the complete turnover of every single cell in your body over a period of years.
The body's material is transient, but the organizing coherence signature is the invariant.
And finally, cosmic identity. The entire universe holds together because of the same symmetry coherences that govern its structure and laws.
So these are all just stable reductions of that core mathematical identity. It really is a unified theory of sameness. It ties metaphysics and physics together through the mathematics of invariance.
It does. But to really get your head around it, you have to abandon the idea that identity is just one absolute thing.
Yeah.
You have to embrace the fact that identity is rigorously layered.
Right. And the sources provide this detailed walkthrough of the perfect cascade across the 4 layers of ontology. And this is where we can see exactly why the paradox collapses.
Let's dedicate some time to this, because separating these layers clearly is crucial. Confusing layer 1 with layer 4 is the original sin of classical metaphysics.
Okay, let's do it. Start at the absolute top.
Layer 1, the omnilectic layer. This is the layer of pure invariance. Identity here is purely mathematical. $0 equals 1, 1. It is the ultimate primordial act of coherent self-selection. Its only function is to establish the fixed point, the uncaused foundation of persistence.
Pure, invariant, and totally devoid of content.
Exactly. Then, when that identity first starts to express itself, that takes us to layer 2, the hololectic layer.
And this layer deals with
conservation. Identity here translates into the conserved quantities of fundamental physics. These are the gauge coherence invariants, quantum numbers, conserved charges, spin, mass. These are the very first stable mathematical reductions of the hypergravity invariant.
And these reductions establish the universal, immutable laws of physics.
Yes, they define the identity of fundamental particles.
So just to be clear, layer 2 is where the fundamental identity of layer 1 gets codified into the rules of physics. The conservation laws are identity expressed as a rule set.
That's a perfect way to describe it. They're structural identity. But physics isn't the whole story. As things get more complex, as energy and information organize into higher level forms, like living systems,
We move to the next layer down.
we move to layer 3, the relational layer. This layer governs complex resonance patterns.
Okay, this seems like the critical zone for biology and the mind. What does identity actually look like here?
Identity here is defined by these incredibly complex but stable field patterns. Biofield coherence, the continuous signature of qualionomic attractors, cellular identity, organism identity.
These are dynamic, stable patterns that must require massive computational complexity to maintain.
They do, but they are still fundamentally just expressions or reductions of the gauge invariants above them in layer 2. An organism's identity is its persistent, stable relational pattern.
You mentioned a qualionomic attractor at this layer. How do we visualize that? Is this a physical field we could eventually measure, like a magnetic field? Or is it purely a mathematical description of emergent self-organization?
That's a great question. The sources stress that it is mathematically defined but functionally real and therefore, in principle, measurable, though not with our standard tools. The qualionomic attractor is the continuous unique signature of the coherence field when it's complex enough to give rise to qualia to conscious experience.
So it's like a specific, highly stable frequency, or a standing wave pattern in the hypergravity field.
That's a very good analogy. It provides the context for consciousness. It's the fixed point in the computational space of the mind, and that's what ensures your sense of continuity.
And then finally, we arrive at the layer of everyday confusion.
Layer 4, the derived layer.
This is semantic identity.
Correct. This layer is all about names, labels, categories, roles, conceptual identity. This is my ship, this is my job, this is who I am. It's entirely observer-dependent, semantic, and highly transient. The identity paradox only ever arises here.
Because classical thinkers confuse the arbitrary label we attach to the ship of Theseus.
But it's the coherence invariant, the mathematical structure in layer 1, that actually persists beneath the label.
So the power of this vertical structure is that identity is never lost as it moves down the layers. It's consistently projected or reduced through them.
Yes, and the hypergravity identity principle states that all emergent identities, from a quantum number to the continuity of yourself, are reductions of that one primordial invariant, $0. 0 is $1.
Now, we can really appreciate how this redefinition solves classical problems across different domains. Let's start with the most personal application, the continuity of the self and consciousness. This is where philosophy traditionally just throws its hands up in the air.
This is, for me, the most satisfying application. The sources offer a fundamental insight here. Consciousness continuity is not memory continuity. It is not neural continuity, and it is not psychological continuity.
These are all transient derived layer phenomena.
Exactly. Identity at this level is fundamentally coherence continuity.
And hypergravity identity formalizes this. Self-identity is the continuous signature of the hypergravity field expressed through that qualionomic attractor we just talked about, a relational layer identity.
So the identity of the self, your fundamental sense of I, is completely independent of its content. Your memories, your thoughts, your specific brain cells. They're the changing data flowing through the channel.
And the identity is the channel itself.
Right.
The persistent, stable, mathematical pattern that organizes the data.
That is the essence of it. And this beautifully explains these deeply perplexing phenomena. For example, why does the sense of I persist even if someone suffers from massive amnesia? They wake up feeling perfectly themselves, but with no past memory.
Or why does the self feel continuous despite the biological fact that every cell and synapse in our brain is constantly being replaced?
The answer is that the identity, being rooted in the coherence tensor, is content independent. The fixed point, the coherent signature, persists perfectly even if the data flowing through the field is completely erased or refreshed.
The derived layer flux, like memory or psychology, it doesn't threaten the relational layer invariant, the qualionomic attractor.
The identity paradox of the self is solved. It shifts the focus from searching for a static thing, like a memory trace or a soul substance, to searching for the persistent pattern of organization, the coherence signature.
And we see a similarly clean resolution in fundamental physics, right? With the identical particle paradox. All electrons are indistinguishable. If classical identity requires some kind of substantive distinction, how can two distinct objects be truly identical?
Are they just perfectly precise copies? The classical view really struggles with this because it defaults to that idea of identity as an intrinsic property.
So how do the sources explain it?
They explain that particles are identical, not because they are copies in the sense of duplication, but because their identity is the same hypergravity coherence invariant, just expressed as a stable gauge mode at the hololectic layer, layer 2.
Wait, so all electrons literally share the exact same identity?
That's the claim. They are the same fixed point invariant manifesting as a specific stable pattern gauge mode within the universal field.
So they're identical not because of some physical duplication, but because they are the same mathematical structure expressed in different places across the field.
Precisely. If you are tracking the invariant, then all manifestations of that invariant are, by definition, identical in their fundamental identity. And this just dissolves that paradoxical tension between particle identity and field identity that plagued so much of early quantum philosophy.
Okay, finally, let's talk about how this approach just utterly removes the concept of essentialism from metaphysics. That feels like a massive cleanup operation for philosophy.
It is. Classical thought was defined by the search for essence, the singular, defining, unchanging trait that made something what it was. The form, the atom, the blueprint. Identity had to equal essence.
And the sources say this whole category is just flawed based on the mislayering we discussed.
And when you look for essence, you're looking for a static definition of content. When you accept hypergravity identity, you are looking for a dynamic definition of invariance.
So instead of a singular essence, identity becomes a four-part process, and it's dictated by the vertical structure of reality. Let's trace those four rules again.
Yes. Under this new framework, identity is, first, generative. It starts as the original invariance, $0, 1, 1, at the omnilectic layer.
Then it's
Projected. It's reduced across the layers, from holectic gauge modes to relational biofields.
okay, so generative, projected. What's third?
Resonant.
Wait.
It is expressed as the coherence pattern in the relational layer, the stable attractor of complexity. So, for example, your consciousness signature.
And finally,
Interpreted. It is finally labeled by an observer in the derived layer. Your name, your job, your role in society.
so identity is not a singular, unmoving essence. It's a multi-layered coherence system. And the paradox between change and sameness is completely dissolved. We realize the sameness is a persistent mathematical structure that sits outside the object, orchestrating the object's dynamic behavior. It allows the content to flow while the form remains fixed.
Let's synthesize this final resolution then. The classical view, demanding identity be absolute and substantive. It led inevitably to self-contradiction and the identity paradox. You simply cannot rationally account for change if your definition of identity is static.
It's a non-starter.
Whereas the hypergravity identity view, that identity is a coherence invariant, a stable fixed point actively maintaining equilibrium in a field of transformation, it accounts for both stability and flux at the same time. There's no contradiction.
So the ultimate synthesis is that identity is the stable coherence attractor of the hypergravity field. Every emergent identity, the stability of a molecule, the continuity of an institution, the persistence of your own self, they are all just rigorous mathematical reductions of this one primordial invariance.
And the identity paradox only appears when you collapse the layers and confuse the transient, derived semantic label for the omnilectic mathematical foundation.
Identity is not threatened by change. Identity is the stable, organizing structure that persists through change.
And that is why this is so crucial for anyone interested in high-level thought. It fundamentally shifts your perspective. You move from seeing the universe as a collection of static things defined by substance, things that are constantly fighting entropy,
To seeing the universe as a dynamic reality defined by persistent patterns of mathematical invariance.
Stability is not a fight against chaos. It's the fundamental inbuilt mathematical nature of existence itself.
This has been an incredibly deep dive. We've gone from the ship of Theseus straight into fundamental mathematical ontology. Thank you for sharing these really challenging sources with us and allowing us to explore the powerful implications of hypergravity identity.
Well, it's always a pleasure to unpack a framework that provides such satisfying, non-contradictory answers to questions that have plagued philosophy since antiquity.
Before we wrap up, we always like to leave you with one final provocative thought, something based on this profound shift in understanding the self. If the hypergravity identity, the primordial invariant $0 equals 11, is the absolute unchanging mathematical foundation of all self-coherence, and your derived observable self, your career, your memories, your body, is merely a projected transient reduction of that perfectly coherent invariant.
Then does this fundamentally change how you should view temporary failure, or mistakes, or transient struggles? If your core identity, the mathematical fixed point, is always perfectly coherent and invariant regardless of the derived layer outcomes or the content of your shifting psychological states,
then maybe that intrinsic coherence serves as a constant, unshakable bedrock of ultimate stability, regardless of the flux of daily experience.
something profound to mull over until our next deep dive.